As I'm sure a lot of you are aware, Markiplier, famous gaming YouTuber, released the film Iron Lung based on the 2022 video game of the same name, and oh my god was it a horrifically great and amazing spice up for the horror genre. From its dreading atmosphere that Mark's character Simon has to navigate through inside the Iron Lung, to its masterfully crafted plot that utilizes the concept of cosmic horror to create a subtle yet rich mystery as to the world of Iron Lung, it is easily a film I would recommend to anyone interested in horror or simply a well-written story in general. Of course, it's not perfect. There are certainly problems, but not to the degree and severity that the YouTuber Vanity Moth, someone who I've covered on the channel before, has presented in one of his recent videos where he calls the film Incomprehensible Theorybait, a take that I highly disagree with, and to be quite honest,
it just rubbed me wrong.
So today, I shall be rebuting said take. However, as always, be sure not to harass Vanity Moth in any way, shape, or form. He is entitled to his opinion as everyone else, even if you may disagree with it. That being said, however, this video is going to get a bit more heated than usual, as this video deeply upset me with the sheer nonsensical argumentation present, and you will see why as the video goes on. So brace yourself for that. As well as, yes, the video debunking his review on the Murder Drones finale is still coming out, though I cannot give a specific time frame, so I apologize, but do keep on the lookout for when that video does eventually come out. Finally, for clarification regarding what Vanity Moth refers to the film as, the term Theorybait refers to.
Now, the first thought that came to my head when Markiplier announced he was making a movie adaptation of Iron Lung, and I then found out that this movie was somehow 2 hours long, was how is he going to make this work? I was reasonably concerned because the game doesn't really offer much material to adapt, and yet that somehow isn't this movie's biggest problem. I have heard a lot of people claim that Iron Lung runs too long, and while I can admit that there are sections of the film that dragged on longer than was necessary, there was never a point in the movie where I wanted the movie to move at a faster pace due to the complete lack of story threads that would encourage me to want the movie to move at a quicker pace. The issue with this movie isn't that it's too slow, it's that very little substance actually happens in the movie. Yippee! Wahoo! Yee!
Do keep in mind that last sentence he said when he refers to the movie having very little substance, as that will become important to note for his future arguments throughout this video and how in turn my counter arguments will be structured.
And that may not be exactly a shocking revelation given this film's premise, but Mark did put in an effort to write a story that is meant to be engaging, but writes it in such a frustratingly obtuse way that it killed any chance this movie had of presenting a story that is engaging or even entertaining. And it starts with the main protagonist. Simon is a pretty uninteresting character. He's literally just an average guy who understandably hates the situation he's in and wants to be free. Now, Mark tried to make Simon a captivating character by expanding on his past and what led to him being a criminal, but just like all other significant storytelling aspects of this movie, his backstory is told so vaguely that I spent more time trying to piece together what he actually did that led to him being a criminal, since there are multiple scenes that really emphasize that whatever he did do was a really big deal, but for the life of me I cannot figure out what the reason for him committing his crime actually was. From what I was able to piece together, Simon is responsible for blowing up a space station that resulted in the deaths of dozens of people, but the movie never reveals anything beyond that. There are hints that it may have been an accident, or that Simon was betrayed by people that he referred to as brothers, and somehow that led to the space station blowing up, but because all the background details are given so sporadically and are unclear, instead of making the character interesting or tragic, I was just left thinking about why I should care about Simon more than actually caring about him as a character.
I hope you all kept in mind what I said, because despite Vanity Moth claiming that the movie has very little substance, his own arguments against the film ironically are the things that suffer said issue in actuality. Vanity Moth will often not explain or elaborate further on his argumentation against the film, only stating the claim of his argument without providing proper evidence and reasoning for said evidence. For example, what he stated regarding Simon is particularly confusing. Vanity Moth frames Simon's backstory as if the details are so unclear that it is impossible to properly piece together his backstory. However, the issue is that not only does he not elaborate on why or what specifically is preventing him from piecing together properly that is the fault of the film, but by the end of the film it becomes almost painfully obvious what exactly happened to Simon, and yet somehow Vanity Moth still doesn't understand what happened to Simon. As such, during times where I will not go into detail on a counter-argument, which there will only be a small amount of, you now know why. Better to leave the failure to provide evidence for an argument alone than to blindly assume what was actually being argued without having the proper evidence to safely debunk said argument. For it risks me accidentally misinterpreting what was actually being argued and turning it either into a strawman argument or worse, shifting the goalpost. Ironically though, what he just described was Simon's backstory. He nailed it to a T, yet still Vanity Moth fails to care for Simon or find him interesting, a point that he also fails to elaborate on clearly, and if his reasoning was solely that it was hard to piece together his backstory in order to make him care, despite the terrifying setting, conditions of the Iron Lung, and the mission itself that Simon has to undertake throughout the film, then as a complete argument alone, it fails immensely. Of course, even with his lack of elaboration, Simon's character is far from uninteresting, because despite Vanity Moth framing his character as simply as a man who is understandably upset about his situation and wants freedom, it could not be further from the truth. As beneath that surface level character description is a man who simply wants to live despite everything that has happened to him, from the quiet rapture to being betrayed by his brothers, causing the destruction of Filament Station, alongside the large amount of blood on his hands with his status as the Butcher. Simon has been through so much hardship despite having no clear purpose to it all. I personally interpret Simon as a directionless wanderer. He's scared and confused about his situation, and as such did things out of sheer desire to live no matter what. As a result of those actions, however, he is now paying the price, living out an execution without purpose in his life, only the persistent desire to live. His arc in my eyes is about filling your life with purpose while living, as it's like the recording that was left behind by the previous convict before Simon said,
"What freedom waits for you? A few dying ships in a sea of dead stars."
There would have ultimately been nothing for Simon, whether he admits it or not, if he was to ever be given his freedom, for in the universe of Iron Lung, a few dying ships in a sea of dead stars is hardly purpose for anyone to live in. Simon understood that, but inversely, focusing on only his freedom, as to him, that was the thing that allowed someone to live. But when it was taken away, it opened his eyes to the fact that freedom was never the thing that allowed someone to live truly, and that the true thing that allowed someone to live was purpose. Purpose, such as being able to save humanity and give purpose to others who are all but waiting to decay and die in an endless black void. It's what motivated and fulfilled Simon's character in the end instead of his freedom, and what ultimately allowed him to live by the end of the film, as he sacrificed himself to give everyone a chance to truly live by saving the black box. The real answer was never the ability to be free, and that it was more worth it than any reward of freedom could possibly offer in the universe devoid of all ability to be free without purpose. Again, this is simply my interpretation from a first viewing of the film, and it may be subject to change, but regardless, I can still confidently say that it is filled with more depth and elaboration than simply stating Simon's character is uninteresting and moving forward without explanation.
As for other characters, there's Ava, who's in charge of making Simon serve his sentence and tells Simon what his mission goal is and what he needs to do to be free, and that's basically all there is to her character that I can confidently say about her.
Okay, so the first night is never usually that bad in any of the games, so I'll play through. Hello everybody, my name is Markiplier.
Despite Vanity Moth yet again failing to elaborate or give substance on his own point, Ava's character is far from barely developed. Quite well rounded actually. Throughout Simon's mission, as Ava is guiding him, we are shown that while Ava herself is a hardened, self-assured leader that is able to keep the mission under control, beneath that part of her character, Ava is ultimately scared, but more importantly, desperate to save humanity due to the quiet rapture. We are shown Ava is a person that truly cares about keeping humanity going, and that is reflected by her actions, causing her desperation to succeed in doing so, such as her involvement in the expedition into the Blood Ocean in the first place in an attempt to find anything that could keep humanity going further, but also in the film's climax where the black box may be the key to saving humanity altogether. When Simon informs her of it, Ava's immediate reaction is of overwhelming renewed hope as she proceeds to risk everything, including her own life, in order to secure the data stored on it. A sacrifice play that not only displays her desperation, as she easily could have sent anyone else in her place to retrieve the black box, but also adds a deeper layer of depth to her self-assurance as a character. Even with her reservations against Simon, Ava ultimately does not think of herself as superior to Simon when it comes to the importance of the mission. Ava compartmentalizes the importance of life regarding the potential others have to help humanity as a whole. Until Simon proves his efforts have concluded with new valuable data for humanity, he is ultimately a prisoner that is due for execution by suffocation. In that moment, Simon becomes even greater than his circumstances in her eyes, and her actions prove that. Ava truly wants humanity to survive and to live herself. As such, knowing the risks of such an undertaking and the fact that Simon could very well be lying, she ventures down into the blood ocean regardless to retrieve the black box herself, which, while it ultimately got her killed, solidifies her devotion to her beliefs despite all the hardship that surrounds her that could dissuade her otherwise. All the hardship, from the hopelessness of her situation after the quiet rapture, having to deal with a difficult convict like Simon, and her own team attempting to dissuade her from pursuing a potential solution any further, Ava doesn't let that stop her because even with it all combined, she strongly and consistently believed in throughout the entire film that humanity could be saved. It is that character motivation that defined all of her actions, including putting aside her reservations with Simon to the point that they eventually came to an understanding, while at the same time serving as her eventual character flaw, as her desperation caused by her deep motivation to save humanity is what got her killed. It is also Ava's desire to save humanity that serves as the film's subversive antithesis to Simon's desire to live, because despite what Simon thought of Ava throughout the film as someone who does not care about living as much as he does, Ava proved him wrong in the end by sacrificing her own life to potentially save humanity and free Simon, concluding Ava's character to its peak in order to display how far Ava will go to achieve her goal while simultaneously solidifying Simon's own desire to live, which he has expressed in numerous times throughout the film, as now he has something to live for by helping to save humanity, allowing Ava's death to become a culmination of layers of depth beneath her actions that not only strengthen Simon's character, but also her own supposedly barely developed character. An interpretation of her character that would all make sense and be evident to someone who was paying attention.
What I can unconfidently say is that for reasons that are never explained, the sample of a skeleton of a monster laying at the bottom of the ocean is supposedly going to help humanity, and that is what she sends Simon down to get in the beginning of the movie, only for there to be a pseudo plot twist that she never actually needed the sample, which I guess is supposed to reveal that Simon and his mission was just an elaborately orchestrated death sentence, which makes absolutely no sense, as that begs the question, why didn't she just have Simon executed and waste all this time and resources on the sub to collect something she doesn't actually need? There is a point where she mentions that she has new orders, so maybe this isn't the case, as maybe she did legitimately want the sample, but she seemingly loses any and all interest in the sample from that point forward, which is why I called this a pseudo plot twist, because I genuinely don't know if this moment was supposed to be a big reveal or not, but I do know that it doesn't make sense either way.
This is not an expedition. It's an execution.
Of course, if that wasn't clear enough of an answer in itself, there is the simple explanation that despite Simon being a convict, with the promise of freedom, Simon becomes a useful tool for Ava in order to explore the blood ocean without the risk of losing a valuable member of the consolidation. As in Ava's eyes, before their eventual understanding at the climax of the film, Simon is simply a violent convict that is earning his place back into society and whose life is ultimately not as important as someone like herself or her crew because of Simon blowing up Filament Station. And since Simon accepts the deal, he now becomes a disposable asset that can now serve as a way for Ava to be able to do the following, which is map out the blood ocean, retrieve any valuable artifacts or information found, and finally, test the Iron Lung for future expeditions.
Why would there be flames? You did test this thing, right?
This is the test.
You may argue that if Ava in the beginning thinks so low of Simon, why wouldn't she execute him in the beginning because of that part of her character? Well, because included in her character as well is her self-assured and strong devotion to her mission of saving humanity. A mission that, despite all of the hardship that surrounds her, does not dissuade her from seeking to achieve the mission by any means necessary. That includes taking advantage of potential assets or tools like Simon, the disposable convict in her eyes, to retrieve valuable data that could help humanity. Ava's dislike of Simon and desire to save humanity can indeed coexist in harmony with each other without the two repelling against each other to the detriment of the end goal of either feeling.
Ava does get a new motivation in the second half of the movie, but this is where the movie completely goes off the rails as far as being able to reasonably determine what is even happening. And it begins with the introduction of the final main character of the film. I know the exact moment this movie lost its charm for a lot of people, and it's when Elsie Lovelock's character is introduced, and the movie just spirals into characters babbling about in-universe lore that the audience is completely out of tune with. It's like if you were thrust into a conversation between two people who were in the middle of debating Elden Ring lore as a person who has never played Elden Ring. Terminology is used that the viewer doesn't understand.
What terminology is used without explanation?
Past events are referenced that up until that point were never referenced before.
When are past events referenced without ever being previously mentioned?
And life philosophies are exchanged without the viewer knowing why said characters believe in said philosophies and what events those philosophies are being applied to.
Oh my god! Oh, I did!
This moment made Iron Lung feel like a spin-off movie in the middle of a cinematic universe that expects the audience to already be knowledgeable about the details of the in-universe lore. At first, I was with everyone else who said that this segment of the movie should have been shortened, but the entire second half of this movie is built on a foundation built around the exchange between these two characters, as it's supposed to be the moment where there's a grand revelation unveiled for Simon that gives clarity as to what the MacGuffin the second half of the movie focuses on is, but it doesn't work because without there being context given to the audience, this revelation is so vague that it's nigh impossible to actually understand what the MacGuffin is, what it does, why everyone wants it, and the consequences for the parties involved if it's successfully delivered by Simon or not.
Now, I would go into immense detail on the object being the black box of the SM-13 that was detailed to Simon when it was partially downloaded onto the Iron Lung, and that Ava was very auditorily shocked by and interested in, to the point that when Simon told her about it, she was willing to risk her own life to retrieve it, which is what got her killed. Or how the black box is a device that stores data such as recordings of its crew that was very auditorily played, one recording being how the blood could be synthesized into food, but it was seen as a bad idea by one of the other crewmates as the blood could be unfit for human consumption. Or how if the black boxes fail to be retrieved, then it dooms humanity to a now permanent path of slow decay and death, as the data contained in the black box that has the potential to save humanity is now lost forever. But based on what you just described, it's immensely clear you yourself were paying attention to the film, right, Vanity Moth? Because to be honest, this is quite a mystery on why you're having this criticism in the first place.
I know with the way that I'm describing Iron Lung, it sounds like I wasn't paying attention to the movie, but when I was in the theater, besides the popcorn I was eating, I was giving Iron Lung my full attention, and I'm not the kind of person who gets bored by movies that are slow or require the viewer to mentally engage with what they are perceiving, but there are so many lore drops and plot details that occur within the movie that are thrown at you with little to no explanation that engaging with Iron Lung feels like an insultingly complex chore that by the end of the movie felt like a waste of cognitive effort.
Start counting.
5, 6, 7.
In 4, damn it! Look at me!
1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3.
Now, was I rushing or was I dragging? Count again.
1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Rushing or dragging?
Rushing.
So you do know the difference!
You, in fact, were not paying attention to the film, because if you actually were, you wouldn't be complaining about, quote, so many unexplained details, and then failing to elaborate on why they're unexplained in the first place. At the very least, you wouldn't be asking the question of why didn't Ava just execute Simon when they literally explained in the beginning of the film that Simon is earning his place back into society despite what he did by being a useful, disposable asset, alongside the other reasons reasons I listed beforehand. I honestly wish I could play more clips from the film to further back up my point, but I don't want to pirate this great independently funded film and masterfully crafted film at that. But even with the lack of clips, the fact that I remember this much about the film 3 weeks after seeing it in theaters by the time this video comes out, and I don't mean to toot my own horn here, really goes to show who was actually paying attention and who was not.
Why is it that apparently most of humanity in space just vanished for no rhyme or reason? Never explained, but I can at least give this one a sort of pass because obviously the rest of humanity doesn't know either.
Why are you framing the characters in the story being unable to explain a mysterious event like the Quiet Rapture as a bad thing, when 1, the whole point of the Quiet Rapture is that it's meant to be an unexplainable event and how it makes sense how there is no evidence to explain how it might have happened, given the Quiet Rapture was described as the stars and planets all suddenly disappearing without a trace. And 2, humanity in real life can't always explain things that exist within our universe as well, such as dark matter for example. Is it bad on us that we can't always explain everything? Must we be forced to be omniscient all the time as well as characters in fiction as well?
But the true mystery of this lore tidbit is how it made the movie better in any way. Why is it that the blood in the ocean once congealed creates oxygen and if touched makes people go insane? No idea, and nobody ever questions or acknowledges it.
I will address this question later.
Why is it for some reason the consciousness of a person who died in a previous expedition is psychically tied to the giant fishworm that's stalking Simon throughout the movie? Your guess is as good as mine.
We'll explain this one as well.
Why is it that Ava desperately wants the info in a black box on the submarine that sank in the previous expedition, but instead of ordering Simon to look for that, she has him go get bone samples? No idea.
It was believed that the SM-13, which contained the black box originally, was destroyed.
What was on the black box that is implied by Ava to possibly be the key to saving humanity? Never explained.
I already explained what was on the black box, so I won't repeat myself.
Why didn't the big fish kill Simon the first chance it got when it obviously was responsible for killing the previous expedition and ended up killing Ava in her sub immediately? I don't know, maybe it's a Markiplier fan or something.
The eel throughout the entire film was intentionally stalking Simon in order to make him go insane, either through the blood itself or having Simon look into the light, so that he would join its hive mind, which we can ascertain based on the eel's numerous voices at the end, as well as its design. However, at the climax of the film, when Simon failed to join its hive mind and was in possession of the black box that could save humanity, a goal that the eel does not want achieved due to its ending dialogue reflecting its disdain for humanity, then locked in on killing both Ava and Simon in an attempt to stop the black box from reaching the surface.
I am fully aware that cosmic horror is defined by being unexplainable.
So you do know the difference!
And I find that the cosmic horror this movie does portray, especially during a psychedelic sequence midway through the movie, is some of the best I have seen put to film. But that doesn't excuse the fact that the way this movie is written is barely comprehensive on just one watch alone.
Why? 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 Why, oh god fucking...
But that's where the main talking point of this video comes into play. This movie feels like it was manufactured to be a film that requires you to rewatch it multiple times just to understand what's going on, and I don't think that's good writing. Iron Lung is less of a horror movie and more of a psychological thriller, and like most psychological thrillers, it doesn't spoon-feed the audience what the meaning behind everything is, so the viewer will still be engaged even upon rewatching the movie. But what separates Iron Lung from movies that did this effectively, like Shutter Island or Donnie Darko, is that those movies gave the audience enough plot details that worked in tandem with each other to form a functional, coherent basis of a story that only gets better as the audience analyzes it further, whereas Iron Lung gave plot details that don't work in tandem with each other, so a general story basis is never formed to begin with, and only becomes functionally coherent once the audience has rewatched and analyzed it multiple times, making the first viewing of the film an intriguing yet deeply unsatisfying viewing experience. And while I do like movies that give enough material while being vague enough to encourage the viewer to mentally engage with the movie, Iron Lung is too vague, to the point where while I was interested in the movie, it wasn't enjoyable enough for me to be invested to rewatch it over and over again just to get the grand payoff of a story that is actually tangible, especially since until it's on streaming, I would have to pay $13 per viewing and 2 hours of my life for each rewatch. So I ask you, what is more likely? Is the average person going to spend their free time and money to rewatch a movie that isn't that good to begin with to just understand it? Or are they going to just watch a YouTube video explaining it to them? Like it or not, we live in the modern age of attention depravity, and Markiplier did kinda build his entire career off of reacting to another indie horror franchise that also had over-convoluted and vague storytelling, which makes me speculate that in the same way that mascot horror games are written to be unnecessarily intricate so that they will get free marketing from the game theorists, the content farms, and react-tubers like Markiplier himself, Iron Lung is written in the same way so that YouTubers will overanalyze the film, use the fact that it was made by Markiplier as the primary talking point to garner interest, and farm the film for views to make as much money as possible, and in doing so making Iron Lung artificially become a topic of cultural significance because everyone is talking about it.
I just gotta hold still? Is that what I gotta do?
I am genuinely astounded by your sheer talent at making stuff up in your head, because Jesus Christ, what the actual hell were you talking about? The film never requires or advertises that you needed to watch it a second time in order to understand it. Just because not every single minute detail is explained to you does not mean the film is not explaining anything to you. All the pieces are there in Iron Lung in order for you to understand the plot of the movie and the motivation of Simon while simultaneously being able to care about his character. For example, the beginning monologue describing the Quiet Rapture was an event where all the planets and stars mysteriously disappeared, as well as Simon's origin that you yourself nailed to a T because he is a convict attempting to earn his freedom after blowing up Filament Station, and finally, Ava's motivation to retrieve the black box at all costs, which simultaneously deepens her barely developed character. These are all aspects of the film that are explained to the viewer if you are paying attention, and therefore makes Iron Lung as a whole a coherent film to follow and understand. Does it have some details in it that aren't explicitly explained to you? Of course. For example, the big eye that shows up and stares down at Simon, and even the blood ocean itself. However, that's because the film, as you said, is a cosmic horror film, which you yourself said is meant to be unexplainable.
I am fully aware that cosmic horror is defined by being unexplainable.
Not everything in horror, or even storytelling in general, needs to be explained in immense detail to the viewer if it's either A, not that important, or B, is meant to be inferred by the viewer either through show don't tell, or through background cues within the world itself as the main plot progresses. The latter of which applies to the blood ocean and the giant eye, which are both aspects of the film that are subtly given information on so that we the viewers can infer and explain the unexplainable nature of Iron Lung through theories for the cosmic horror film. Things are allowed to be unknown in storytelling. In fact, one of the greatest fears in horror and in real life in general is the fear of the unknown, because whatever is unexplained means whatever it is in reality can possibly be the most terrifying thing imaginable, but we as the audience don't know that until it's either too late or as a way to prolong dread throughout the horror experience. So long as not knowing what is unknown within the story does not negatively impact the understanding of the plot and characters within the story, of course. A good example being in the video game Dead Space, where while it is unknown to the player and Simon himself why exactly the black marker is creating necromorphs or what its origins are specifically, those questions with unknown answers do not negatively impact the understanding of the story or the characters, because knowing the answers is not relevant to the plot of the game being to escape the Ishimura. Therefore, allowing the unknown nature of the black marker to instead become an asset to the story and the world rather than a detriment. I'm not saying that a rewatch won't deepen your enjoyment or understanding of a film in terms of themes, for example, or that the little unexplained details won't become clear, but as long as the main plot can make sense and the characters' motivations and arcs are properly followed through on the first watch, then the quality and storytelling of the film remains intact and does not equate to incoherent storytelling, and certainly does not require a rewatch. Just because of questions like why the eel has a telepathic connection to Simon, or why when the blood is touched it makes you go insane, or even how the Quiet Rapture occurred are valid questions to ask, that does not mean that it's valid criticism, because as you said yourself,
I am fully aware that cosmic horror is defined by being unexplainable.
Questions without answers. The horror of the unknowable and incomprehensible. That's how it's always been since its inception as originally Lovecraftian horror with H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu back in the 1930s, and it has remained that way all the way up to current day with cosmic horror art like Iron Lung following the same set of parameters. You are making stuff up in your head, because going by this logic, any film that intentionally leaves things unexplained or allows you to make theories about it or requires you to infer aspects about it that are not explicitly explained to you are poorly written pieces of art. Which is not only baffling but borderline entitled, as a piece of art is not obligated to spoon-feed details about its content when the audience can piece together and infer for themselves the nature of the art so long as the art is well crafted in order to do so. Especially when the point of the art is the nature of it being unknown, a fact that I have already demonstrated how Iron Lung succeeds at just that. But what's even more baffling is the last part about the film being intentionally written to be incoherent, because yes, it is hard to speculate that, because all you've done is speculate and present evidence of incoherent storytelling that is in reality blatant admission that you yourself did not pay attention to the film by asking questions like why didn't Ava just execute Simon that get answered in the literal beginning of the film. To even go so far as to suggest the possibility that Mark only wrote the film the way he did in order to gain profit off of rewatches instead of out of genuine love for the game as he was adapting and horror storytelling in general, solely on the basis that you didn't understand the film and weren't paying attention to it at all, which I've already demonstrated how you weren't in fact paying attention, is not only completely nonsensical but also incredibly bad faith to assume that of Mark's character as not only an artist but also as a person. It comes across as you attempting to morally grandstand on Iron Lung by trying to worm your way into making Mark seem like a bad guy, or at the very least a hack writer for essentially scamming his fans when that cannot be further from the truth. And in the end, simply dilutes whatever shred of criticism you had from the start by mixing it in with baseless speculation of foul play when there never was even a hint of it in the first place. Ultimately, however, when it comes to Vandymoff's claim, the burden of proof falls upon him to either prove his speculation or at the very least provide sufficient grounds for said speculation to be valid. The only reason I went into such detail rebuting the shortly written criticism is because the nature of the claims were too intentionally authorial despite zero grounds to stand on and therefore deserve careful scrutiny.
Iron Lung isn't a bad film, but it borderline is. To give the movie its deserved credit, Mark's acting is fine. It's not going to win any awards or anything, but after the initial 15 or so minutes, I was able to forget I was watching a famous YouTuber and was able to see Simon as his own character instead of Markiplier trying to be a character. The cinematography is the best part of the movie, with well-positioned and creative shots and camera angles, and the score is good as it carried the climax of the film. So much so that despite barely understanding what was even happening in the movie at that point, the soundtrack was still able to make me feel tense. But as I have been accentuating practically throughout this entire video, Iron Lung's writing and storytelling is nearly unintelligible, and although I might enjoy it more on a second, third, or maybe fourth watch, a movie should at least feel entertaining upon its first watch. And with a movie like this that doesn't involve action sequences, comedy, or deep character dynamics, this film's writing was solely responsible for whether or not this film would be captivating or thought-provoking enough to be worth 2 hours of your life, and I don't think it lived up to that responsibility. If it wasn't for the fact that Iron Lung was an adaptation of a game, Markiplier's heavy involvement, or its underdog story of being built on a $3 million budget with no studios supporting it, I think most people would see it as I do and label it as an original and creative endeavor that equates indirect writing as being deep and clever while being pretentious in how it expects its audience to spend their time rewatching it over and over just so they can be able to say that they understood the movie and not be labeled as media illiterate by their peers.
Hello, everybody. My name is Markiplier, and I am a fish.
Hello, everybody. My name is Markiplier.
At this point, what I'm upset about is simply the sheer condescending attitude you have against Markiplier. I'm not trying to be an ultra-tier defender for Markiplier, I don't watch him that much, but the amount of baseless claims at the end of this video that Markiplier is simply scamming his fans based on what you said about the movie intentionally being written to require rewatches, with now on top of Mark apparently only being praised for how good his film is being on the sole basis that he's a famous YouTuber or a Hollywood underdog, and not because of how good his actual writing is simply dumbfounding. Iron Lung is not the golden child brainchild of cinema right now. It is not some untouchable piece of artistic filmmaking that anyone who dares to criticize it shall be sent to FNAF Ultimate Custom Night. It has problems. People have been criticizing it. One of my own criticisms is the poor audio mixing, for example, and one of my friends' criticisms is that Mark's acting is not good enough to reflect Simon's character as the Butcher. These are real criticisms of the film, the former of which being a popular one. These are problems that cannot be solved easily by simply paying attention to the film, like yours of again, why didn't Ava execute Simon? However, at this point, asking for any depth to your arguments or even clear substance to them has no point, as it has become clear that you are incapable of doing so for this film, so I won't bother.
I applaud that Markiplier and everyone involved took a risk with this movie, but just because the underdog took a risk doesn't mean that we all have to pretend that risk was more effective than it was. And if I am to respect Markiplier as a filmmaker, the best thing I and anyone else who watches this film who respects his creative endeavors can do is be honest and treat him like you would treat any other filmmaker. And if I'm to do that, my final consensus on Iron Lung is that it's a severely unsatisfying movie that is as incomprehensible as it is ambitious.
If I'm being honest, I can't say I enjoyed this review. I can't say it's well structured or well founded on any basis of proper evidence in order to build off of a claim. This video is riddled with points just flung out like a machine gun without any elaboration while simultaneously coming off as an insincere, ironically pretentious, and an accusatory statement against Markiplier's film in order to paint it in a bad light based on no tangible or well-founded evidence solely on the reviewer's own inability to comprehend what he was watching in the cinema in front of him. And of that note, all I have to say is, Vanity Moth, if you're watching this, no hard feelings, but please do better. Of course, these are just my thoughts. Let me know yours down in the comments below, and I'll see y'all in the next video.
Beautifully. Oh!